missing me, punks? Ah, I'm touched. I've missed you too, and have been thinking about making my channel more sharing, caring, loving, and an inclusive future fit for all.
Rubbish! It's time for something hitherto conspicuous by its absence, namely a competitive battle report from Warhammer the Old World. A Warriors of Chaos mirror match between Dr. Blaxill and Scott. This impudent punk shot my Bretonians off with Alariel Incarnate of Life in turn 1 in a recently concluded event which he won. So, will Dr. Blaxill get his revenge or not? Watch and find out. As for my absence, well, I wanted to learn the rules properly first before I committed my tabletop exploits to the scrutiny of online distribution. Just as how, when I liberated my first bike, I had to learn to rinse the cops on the motorway before I decked it out with the vet thrashers. So, it's 35 games in, punks, and I still can't help hyperventilating in a mixture of joy and frustration at these rules. I realise that water has passed under the bridge since we last spoke. The tyrannical Ubermensch has been good enough to release an FAQ to clear up some ambiguities in his previous diktats. And an opportunity, not that he took it, to fix some of the abundant problems with this game for the benefit of carnivorous competitive players. Make no mistake, punks, my door remains open for any aristocrat or hanger-on who thinks he's a favoured concubine of the means of production to come down onto the streets and fight. But somehow they never come. And soon it'll be too late. Before the battle, punks, an announcement and a call to arms. I'm co-organising the Twin Sentinels Grand Tournament, which is going to be held at Firestorm Games in Cardiff on the 22nd and 23rd of June. 5 rounds, 2,000 points of Warhammer the Old World. Your organisers, myself and particularly my co-host Chris, were amongst those who kept Warhammer going in the dark times and have organised numerous 8th edition competitions. Now, we turn our tools to this new chapter. We have space for 100 players at Firestorm Games, and we're looking forward to it being a fantastic event. Yes, you have to have your troops based on the right-sized bases or use converters, but any proxy models will do, and those legacy armies are allowed. I've left a link to the comp pack in the description, but if you fancy a little saunter down to Wales this summer for fantastic Warhammer and still more fantastic company, give it a look. Right, on to our featured presentation, and let me tell you about my Warriors of Chaos army. Now I should say that rather than simply picking the very best thing that I possibly can, I'm regarding these early games of Warhammer the Old World to be laboratories for experimentation. So, with that in mind, I haven't decided to bring that dragon, which, to be honest, makes games as boring as hell. Therefore, I've gone and picked something else, which is also very powerful, but not quite as game-ruining as that lizard. So, let me introduce you to my characters. So first, we've got Miss Aurora Mirror rocking her electric guitar. Miss Mirror is a wizard with demonology. She's got 5 spells thanks to having a spell familiar, and she's got the Infernal Puppet! This ridiculous toy is guaranteed to end the playtime of enemy wizards, by meaning they have to roll another dice to cast their spell and discard the highest one. Then you get to dispel with your normal 2d6 in exactly the same manner. A real party-ruining magic item, and obviously a must for any competitive Warriors of Chaos list. So, Miss Mirror has got all the good spells from Demonology. The Summoning, the Steed of Shadows, Demonic Vigor, the Gathering Darkness, and the other good ones too. The real power plays for Demonology are the Steed of Shadows, which enables you to throw an infantry unit around the battlefield 24 inches, the Summoning of course, and then in particular Demonic Vigor, which enables you to charge further and be tougher and stronger. The Demonic Vessel spell that she also has does require her to be in a unit, and so is nowhere near as useful. We've also got Miss Mirror's sister, Lambda Gemfire, in this army as well. Now Lambda is a level 2 Chaos Warrior Sorcerer, but she's got the Ruby Ring of Ruin. She's rocking battle magic, and I'm lucky enough to be able to roll Fireball, which is a 50-50 chance given she's also got a spell familiar. She also swaps one of her spells for the Blue Fire of Tzeentch, meaning this lady has got 3 magic missiles there on her own. She's also going to be riding with these 5 Marauder Horsemen, who are going to give her another +1 to cast. The rationale with this is to bring her and the Ruby Ring of Ruin outside of enemy dispel range on one of the flanks to allow her to ping off all these magic missiles, potentially something I think is very powerful. Right, my general for today is Chairman Banderas. He's a Chaos Lord on a demonic steed, with full plate armour, a shield, Favour of the Gods, the Ogre Blade, and the Paymaster's Coin. Now, this guy's pretty cheap and cheerful, just being 327 points. He's got that outrageously broken Warhammer the Old World 360-degree arc of vision, and he's bringing 5 attacks with +2 strength and D3 wounds thanks to his Ogre Blade. The Paymaster's Coin, meanwhile, allows him to re-roll rolls to hit in 1 round of combat, which he can declare after you've seen the to-hit roll dice. Now, because he's got this Favour of the Gods and this Praying, which is one of the signature motifs of Warriors of Chaos armies, by the time he gets into combat, let's say turn 3, he's probably got a couple of good buffs in there. Maybe he's got an extra attack, maybe an extra strength, maybe an extra toughness. Look, he's no dragon, and to be honest, for only another 200 points more, it probably would make competitive sense to always put that dragon on the table because it's so stupidly OP. But sometimes I do think in Warhammer, whatever edition you play, it can pay to do things a little bit better than your opponent so you can still beat him, rather than absolutely smash his face off and make something unkillable and do something 3 times as well. I feel a lot of players succumb to the Munchkin impulse and really go into overkill. They load 9 nuclear warheads into their missile when really the enemy would be dead if they had 1. And that's the rationale behind this more modest Chaos Lord build. It's also the rationale behind my final character choice. We've got here an exalted champion, Larry Luddite. All he's got is a lance and a shield and Favour of the Gods to allow him to do that prayer munchkining. He's also got a demonic mount as well. Chances are, with a couple of good rolls on that table and the fact that the demonic mount is really rather strong and the exalted champion is good anyway, that he's probably still going to be better than about 60 or 70% of enemy characters, and because he's also got that 360-degree arc of vision, should also be able to pick his fights. These 2 horsey chaps are there to just simply get the job done, not do it twice. So, what about the rest of my army? Let's have a chat about the core. Now, the Warriors of Chaos core I think is rather weak. Chaos Knights I don't really think have any competitive use at all with their crappy armor save and the fact that they've only got 1 attack. And Chaos Warriors I also think are extremely weak and feeble. That's simply because all infantry in Warhammer the Old World, unless you're going to literally commit to running line hammer, is garbage almost without any exception. Now, all my core here is informed by the things that I do think are quite good in the Warriors of Chaos list. The first is 5 Marauder Horsemen with flails and throwing weapons. These are mainly there to give that +1 to Lambda Gemfire, but the Skirmishing Horsemen I do think are quite good, entirely because of this 360-degree vision arc. We've then got dogs, and well, these canine critters have really gone through the upgrades in the kennel. I've decided to pick 4 units of them. Well, to start with, they've got better stats, another point in leadership, they're the same number of points as they were in 8th Ed, and of course you can use the marching column rule with them, and they can move through cover. These can run up to the opponent's face if you run them in lines and block all his charges. Furthermore, if they flee, as Chaos Hounds often do, and they rally, the suckers can just move again after a reform, and so once again they're going to be in his face. Chaos Hounds were good before, but boy, they're absolutely fantastic now. The last thing that's good, I think, are Forsaken. Now, Forsaken were garbage in 8th edition, so it's nice to see them bring back something now. Now, Forsaken, I think, you need to run them with the Mark of Khorne for hatred. These guys have got D3 random attacks and Furious Charge, and so often you're going to get into a situation where you're absolutely re-rolling a bucket load of attacks. They can also get potential poison and killing blow as well, so they can really be very dangerous. I like running them in just picket lines of 5. Now, they are impetuous, and that is a complete liability, and yes, they are infantry, albeit with a slightly better movement. I like having Forsaken because you can throw them around with the Steed of Shadows, and because they're open order infantry, you can get to do that little reform at the end, providing you don't go more than double your movement. Sometimes you can thread these little picket lines into gaps on the opposition line, and thus be able to threaten him from angles he's not expecting. I've got 3 units of these Forsaken, 2 units of 5 and 1 unit of 6. Into the rest of my army, well, we've got units of Dragon Ogres. Boy, Dragon Ogres were crap in 8th edition, so it's really nice to see them back because I really like the models. We've got 1 unit of 4 Dragon Ogres with heavy armour, great weapons and a Shartak, and 1 unit of 3 Dragon Ogres also with that command piece. You can also run units of single Dragon Ogres as well, which can be highly effective. But these guys with their 3-up armour save and their great weapons can really resist opposition charges and still have the opportunity to strike back. They've also got 2 stomps each at strength 5. I've put Dragon Ogres into equivalent situations where they're facing double the opposition number of points and they've still emerged quite well. They are really an excellent piece to throw into the lion's mouth. Finally, to round off the points, we've got a single Chaos Spawn with the Mark of Khorne. The main point of Chaos Spawn in this is to be thrown around with the Steed of Shadows and act as another piece of chaff. Unfortunately, the fact that Chaos Spawn are random movers doesn't really allow you to guard flanks as was the case in previous editions, because you don't spin the model round before you move, which has made Chaos Spawn sadly I think a bit redundant in what they could do. So rather a work in progress of an army, but I think this is the direction I'm moving towards for competitive play, that is, if I decide to leave my dragon at home. Right, okay, let me tell you what I'm facing over the table with this Warriors of Chaos mirror match. And in some respects, it is indeed a mirror match, because there are some similarities on what we're bringing. We're both going heavily in for magic missiles, but Scott has done this to an even more extreme extent than I have. So, he's got 2 level 4s that can be seen in this warrior block here. One of them has got the Skull of Catum, which gives him and other wizards within 3 inches +1 to cast. They're also all rocking the Mark of Tzeentch, which means they get a further +1 to cast if they're in a unit with a strength of at least 10. He's got 5 magic missiles in this unit no less, thanks to one wizard having battle magic and the other having demonology. He's also got Steed of Shadows and Arcane Urgency, which means that Brick of Chaos Warriors can potentially fly 48 inches in a single turn, thanks to being able to move with Steed of Shadows and then move again with Arcane Urgency. He's also got a Demon Prince rocking battle magic, but he hasn't been lucky with the spell he's drawn, has had to simply pick Hammer Hand. Also a Chimera here as well for some more speed, and then 2 Gorebeast chariots there guarding the flank. The rest of the army, those Chaos Knights and that single Dragon Ogre, really there I think to make up the points. Scott's army isn't really designed to do that much fighting. The 2 Gorebeast chariots, the Chimera and the Demon Prince, and when it's got the right kind of buffs on it, that Chaos Warrior unit as well, which ought to be able to get itself into some very advantageous positions with this crazy degree of movement, which literally means it will be teleporting around the battlefield and it will be quite hard for me to stop it, given that it's got +6 to cast with everything. That warrior block is also of course where the points all are, around half of this army in that single unit that's going to be flying 48 inches around the battlefield each turn. That being said, I do think that if I can get into contact with the Demon Prince, especially with my own general who has a 360-degree arc of vision, and even if I can get one of my beta units to engage that warrior block, I'm going to be able to potentially assassinate the level 4s and pin that unit in place and then be able to win. So here's the deployment. Now, deployment is one of the phases in Warhammer Fantasy Battles that I enjoy the most. Partly because very often I tend to pick multiple smaller units armies which have the capacity to out-deploy their opponent. And so a lot of the time I'm placing things on the board in response to what my opponent is doing because he's dropped his pieces before I have. Now of course in Scott's case, many of the threats in his army are incredibly mobile. He's got a flying Chaos Warrior brick thanks to the Steed of Shadows, and he's got a Chimera and a Demon Prince. And so I'm going to have to deploy according to what the limitations and strengths are of my army, rather really than in response to him, because he's going to be moving about so rapidly. Accordingly, I place most of my main threats, the 2 Dragon Owner units and those 2 mounted heroes, in the centre of the battlefield. I'm less bothered about the placement of my little Forsaken picket lines, because I can throw them around with my own Steed of Shadow spells. There's also enough space here and there on the deployment zone for these little lines of dogs with their marching column rule to be able to get in there and be able to run up to the opponent and block charges that I don't want. I found this to be a very effective setup with my Chaos Army thus far in games of Warhammer the Old World that I've played. The thing about my army that doesn't really work with deployment though is my wizard there on foot, Miss Mirror. Of course these Forsaken have the loner rule and so they're not able to be joined by characters, which is something I'd been getting wrong up till now. Thus Miss Mirror is going to have to cower behind these troops to avoid being targeted by the many magic missiles in the army. On the left hand flank I should have hopefully an easier time. My secondary wizard, Miss Mirror's sister Lambda Gemfire, is going to be mostly deployed with those Marauder Horsemen to benefit from their +1 to cast, and hopefully to get her out of the dispel range of the main enemy centre of power. Scott's deployment is I think a bit more automatic than my own is. He's got the chariots on both sides, the warrior block in the centre, and the single Dragonova blocking those Khorne Chaos Knights. Now, the real threat in Scott's army is, of course, this block, because it's got all these wizards in it. The wizards in there are going to be getting +6 to cast, thanks to the Skull of Catum and the fact that they've got Mark of Tzeentch, and there are 2 level 4s. We've got 5 magic missiles in this bunker, no less, and they're all going to be knocking out with this +6. There's also the Infernal Puppet in that unit as well, to limit my own casting. While Miss Mirror also has the Infernal Puppet, I'm still going to be bullied out there in the centre by this +6 to cast. This is why I think this is such a powerful build. Destroy the enemy spellcasting with the Infernal Puppet, and then simply try and outgun them with this +6. If you're getting a +6 to an enemy +4, chances are you're going to be beating him more times than not. Therefore, I am fully expecting these units in the centre of the board to be subjected to a heavy rain of fire from fireballs, blue fire of Tzeentch, and summonings. Right, so off we go for my turn 1, which I win on the roll-off. So I barrel my whole army forwards. Not too decisively, I want to maintain my battle line, but I push my Dragon Ogres up and my Forsaken and get my Dog Darts into a position where they can run in front of the enemy forces. I'm slightly more aggressive with Chairman Banderas, as you can see, and I try to stick his base in the wood so he can see through it. That should hopefully give me an opportunity to charge most things if Scott decides to push up his army conventionally. In the magic phase, I suffer a miscast, rolling a double 1 and a dimensional cascade. That knocks a couple of wounds off the Dragon Ogre and a wound off Miss Mirror as well. Miscasts, of course, in Warhammer the Old World, nowhere near as frightening because you can't lose your wizard, and obviously if you run your wizard on her own, she's not going to hit that many other people with the template. There is some good news for me in the magic phase though, because I'm able to get a Steed of Shadows off and throw one of those Forsaken picket lines out there to the side. You can see it on the left-hand side of Scott's Gorebeast's chariot. I was considering putting it in the middle, towards the flank of his Chaos Knights, where his Demon Prince would have been blocked by his Chimera, but in the end I decide I like that unit on the flank. That's going to give Scott something to think about. In Scott's turn 1, there's not really a lot to write home about. My Spawn actually lurched forwards quite a long way and gave that Gorebeast chariot an outside chance of a charge, and it goes for it. It doesn't make it, but it does get far enough away from my Forsaken to get out of their arc. It's probably a slight mistake from me there. I probably should have left more of an angle on those Forsaken to cover a wider arc to potentially get that Gorebeast chariot. Still, they've got a good opportunity there though with those Chaos Knights. As it stands, Scott's worried enough about that to actually slide his Chimera in front of those Forsaken. I think this might actually be rather a tight fight. In the old days, the Chimera would have absolutely wrecked a unit like this, but these are new times, and the Forsaken have gone up, and that Chimera has gone down. So we'll see. In the centre, which I confess I don't have a photo of, the Demon Prince moves up and uses the forest as cover. Magic Missile phase, which is what it becomes, sees Scott bully out several of them with his +6 to my +4, even overcoming my Infernal Puppet. 2 go off, and the smaller Dragon Ogre unit on the right takes 3 wounds, but that's not enough to drop one of the hulking beasts. On the right hand side, out of picture, Scott tries to capitalise on another mistake I've made, which is pushing up my blue unit of Forsaken too much. I've left the Gorebeast chariot a very marginal hairline charge, but he doesn't make it. Right, on to my turn 2, and I've definitely got some opportunities. In my strategy phase, Miss Mirror tries to cast Demonic Vigor on one of the Dragon Ogre units, and again miscasts, and again gets a dimensional cascade. The odds of this, 4 double ones in succession, are pretty minor, but she loses another wound and damages the Dragon Ogres a bit too. I'm going to have to be a bit careful with her now from here on in. Charge-wise, my Forsaken pile into the Chimera, and also the ones that were subjected to that Gorbeast chariot charge there on the right also make it into that. I think I've got an excellent chance of dispatching both of these units. In the rest of my movement, I again push up. The Chaos Hounds here run themselves in front of the Chaos Warrior block there in the forest, and Miss Mirror once again gets Steeds of Shadows off and throws another Forsaken picket line into the side, with those Chaos Warriors in front and the Gorbeast chariot behind. Again, that's another nasty little line unit in a place that Scott doesn't want it. Meanwhile, we perform some more chaff with the Chaos Hounds there, chaffing the Chaos Knights, and also run round my general into the open battlefield where he can stare out that Demon Prince. I think that's a combat that I want. The Demon Prince does have a magic sword, I think it's the Giant Blade, but my general has definitely got the advantage, and so I think Scott wants to avoid that combat if he can. The only thing that goes less well for me though is my Chaos Spawn doesn't make it into that Gorbeast chariot. Still, I've got Lambda and all those Marauder Horsemen there to try and cart magic missiles into it in the shooting phase. Note, I've tried to be quite careful here with where I've positioned them, ensuring that the Demon Prince's line of sight to them is blocked by the Gorbeast chariot. Line of sight in Warhammer the Old World is something you've definitely got to think about rather more, because things block each other, and so, while this is quite irritating, and I have found it irritating, it does represent a strategic facet of the game, which was probably a little less there in 8th edition, where models could see through each other. The shooting phase is a frustrating one, and Lambda doesn't get any of her magic missiles off, and so that Gorbeast chariot remains undamaged. In the combat phase we do a bit better. The Chimera drops 2 wounds and slays only 1 Forsaken, but manages to just give ground. On the right hand side though, my Forsaken that charged that Gorbeast chariot suffer a catastrophic defeat. They roll only a 1 on their random attacks, and also get the Killing Blow mutation, which is of no use against the Gorbeast chariot. Somehow we whiff them all, and the Gorbeast chariot manages to kill 2 Forsaken. I decide I don't want that chariot having a chance of reforming, so I elect not to use their stubborn rule, and instead chance my arm on the break test. Unfortunately I fail it, and the Forsaken run away, and the Gorbeast chariot pursues. Not only does it catch them and eliminate them, in Warhammer the Old World you're able to pursue and reform at the end of your pursuit move, and the Gorbeast chariot passes its leadership test and reforms to the side to stare those dogs and the Dragon Ogres in the flank. This is a really swingy mechanic in Warhammer the Old World. The fact that you can also reform after you've overran or after you've pursued means that you can get units facing in exactly the right direction to go into your opponent's flanks actually rather easily. In this case, I'm about to suffer a catastrophic flank charge because a bunch of guys charged a chariot and messed it up. I think that's a little bit of an unsteady mechanic there, and one that I'm not really a fan of, even though of course I'm talking as someone who's about to get shafted by it, so perhaps I'm a bit biased on this occasion. Right, on to Scott's turn too, and of course he elects to charge those dogs with that chariot that's now facing the side. I'm okay with that, because at least I'm going to make him pass a redirection test. I flee with the dogs, and the chariot goes and passes it, and crashes into the side of those Dragon Ogres, which of course can't react. On the other side of the battlefield, that chariot that survived Lambda Gemfire's missiles crashes into the spawn. Scott decides he's going to gamble with his warrior block, and actually decides to move it forwards, even though the Forsaken there are threatening his back. He does this so he can just about thread a line between the gaps between that 3-man Dragon Ogre unit and the 4-man Dragon Ogre unit with Larry Luddite there on the side. With a lot of laser pointing, we decide it's possible for the 2 level 4 wizards in that Chaos Warrior unit to thread a line through the gap between these units so they can touch the side of Miss Mirror's base. That was very sporting of you, Dr. Blaxill, I hear you say. Well yes, punks, this is unfriendly turf. If I meet you on my streets, don't expect me to be so nice. In the magic missile phase, though, Lady Luck comes rather knocking on my door. The first spell, which is Blue Fire of Tzeentch, lasers 2 wounds off Miss Mirror, and I roll a double 6 to save her. The next one knocks her down 3 wounds, and needing 3 5-ups on 3 dice, she goes and gets them. Well, that was rather a dramatic reversal of fortune, wasn't it? Couldn't roll anything other than double 1s at the beginning of the game, and now rolls a cascade of 6s. Down the big long snake, and then up the great long ladder. Another magic missile from Scott is cast on the Dragon Ogres. This manages to fell one of their number who had been damaged earlier by Miss Mirror's frequent dimensional cascade. However, this also has unintended consequences, as we shall see later. Meanwhile, you'll notice that Demon Prince, instead of fighting my general, has flown over the Dragon Ogres and is there threatening Miss Mirror. In the rest of the combat phase, the chariot chops up that miserable spawn beneath its scythed wheels, and the chariot in the side of my unfortunate Dragon Ogres makes them give ground. This is one of those perverse situations, of which are very common in Warhammer the Old World, where it would have actually been better for me to fall back in good order, because then I'd have been able to reform my Dragon Ogres and get more attacks on that chariot the next turn, rather than simply be stuck with it in my flank for getting a more favourable combat result. In the other ongoing combats, the Chimera and the Forsaken tie at 1 apiece and they're going nowhere. The Chaos Knights that are behind the Dragon Ogre charge those dogs that I put in front of it, and so emasculated and pathetic are these Chaos Knights that they only manage to kill 3 dogs. The remaining 2 break and flee, but given that they're not even under 25%, they're going to be back later. In the fluff, Khorne Chaos Knights are described as mighty warriors who behead kings and offer them before the Skull Throne. But now in Warhammer the Old World, with their garbage stats, they can't even put down a bunch of miserable old mutts. Right, so moving on to Blaxill turn 3. Those dogs that ran away from the Gorbeast chariot rally and turn themselves into a line, ready to run in front of those Chaos Knights and that Dragon Ogre. In my charge phase, that 5-man picket line of Forsaken behind Scott's main warrior block declare a charge into its rear. Now, despite being virtually on top of this, in 8th Ed I would have needed all of a 2-inch charge. Because you have to pay for your wheel in Warhammer the Old World, this makes this charge a lot more difficult. It's become doubly difficult because those Forsaken are in a forest, which means that they have to discard the higher of their 2 charge dice. In the end, with a low roll, hideously embarrassingly, despite being literally within spitting distance of the rear of the Chaos Warriors and probably a game-winning charge, the Forsaken stumble forwards pathetically. This is unfortunately one of these daft occasions where you're really going to need a compass if you're going to measure precisely whether your unit has got the distance to be able to complete its charge by wheeling. I know you don't have to pay for wheeling if it would cause your charge to fail, but very often you do, even to get that corner clip. If you punks at Games Workshop are listening, I appeal to you, please bring back closest to closest and give us the free wheel during the charge. It would reduce arguments, make the game faster, and you don't gain anything by keeping it in. Yes, I know some of you punks don't like criticism, but there are plenty of other channels you can go to just go and be ultra positive. On the Dr. Blaxill channel, you're going to get thrilling battles and thrilling moaning side by side. Anyway, speaking of something thrilling, by killing one of those Dragon Ogres from the unit in front of Miss Mirror with his spare magic missile, Scott has inadvertently opened up the Demon Prince that he sat behind that to a charge from my general. Chairman Banderas unexpectedly spurs his mount, backwards needless to say, into the Demon Prince to start a hopefully decisive combat that will let me get back in this game. I'm going to particularly need this because I think Miss Mirror's survival prospects are pretty limited. She got away with it last time, but now that Chaos Warrior block is suddenly going to be able to start hopping over my own troops with its Steed of Shadows without having to march, so she's going to be lined up for another bunch of magic missiles next turn. To give her the best chance I possibly can, I run her backwards to try and get out of range of these spells if Scott manages to mess up the Steed of Shadows. Meanwhile, my lone hero on a horse, Larry the Luddite, charges that Gorbeast chariot. The Dragon Ogres, meanwhile, form up to the side to threaten the side of that Chaos Warrior block. I dare say they'll be gone with Steed of Shadows, but at least I'll be able to crash into the side of that Gorbeast chariot and finally destroy it even if they do. The combat phase proves to be a mixed bag, but mostly still good for me. Chairman Banderas doesn't fight well against the Demon Prince, but he manages to wound him once, and because I win combat by 1, he crumbles another wound. Meanwhile, those 3 Forsaken fighting the Chimera stab the beast in the gut and bring it down. Meanwhile, against that amazingly overperforming Gorby's chariot on the right-hand side, it manages somehow to win combat, with Larry missing with all his attacks and the Dragon Ogres doing nothing either. It breaks the single remaining Dragon Ogre, and Larry sticks there, ready to try and deck it out with this chariot in the next turn. That chariot has now been charged twice and got away with it, and destroyed 2 Chaos units. Can it make it a third? Scott's turn 3 promises to be rather an exciting one. That single Dragon Ogre that he's had hanging around the top of the battlefield flanks my main Dragon Ogre block. Hopefully I should be able to still see that off to maintain my strategically advantageous position. Meanwhile, the Chaos Knights in front of that latest dog line are obliged to charge them. Perhaps more importantly, the main Chaos Warrior block and Wizard bunker get that Steed of Shadows off, flying over all my units and plonking themselves in front of Miss Mirror, with the crosshairs zeroing in on her for a barrage of magical artillery. In the magic phase, Scott's Chaos Warrior Wizards get off 2 magic missiles in Miss Mirror, and between them score 5 wounds. Once more, the Chaos Gods spit in Scott's face and kiss mine as Miss Mirror passes all 5 saves on 5 up. However, Scott does manage to raise a pillar of fire in front of Miss Mirror, and that's going to be passing over her on the next turn, so she's going to have to run the gauntlet again. The combat phase is again a very dramatic one. The first thing that happens is that Scott's Dragon Ogre, which charges the side of my Dragon Ogre, wins combat and makes me fall back in good order. This is a good result for me, because it means that I can turn round and face him. What is not so good is the combat between Larry Luddite and that infernal chariot. The Gorbeast and the charioteers hit and wound with all 5 of their attacks, slicing Larry Luddite into prosciutto ham. There's better news for me elsewhere, as Chairman Banderas beheads that Demon Prince with his Ogre Blade, banishing him back to the realm of chaos. I think the Demon Prince is crap in Warhammer the Old World. Do you agree? Answers on a postcard. Moving up to the north on the supposedly magnificent earth-tremoring charge of those Khorne Chaos Knights, kills a pathetic 2 dogs, and their pooch purgatory continues as the mutts pass their leadership test and only give ground. My turn 4 begins with an unwelcome return to reality, as Miss Mirror finally succumbs to Scott's magic and is roasted by the Pillar of Fire. On the left-hand side of the battlefield, I decide to put Lambda Gemfire into the side of those Chaos Knights which are fighting those dogs. It's a risky charge, but I think it's probably worth doing. The Forsaken also try a charge into the side of the Chaos Knights, but once again can't wheel round. Incidentally, I've got no idea why those Forsaken are facing the other way round. They should be facing towards the Chaos Knights. Those poor Forsaken, who keep getting trapped in the woods, once again try and charge out, and once again aren't able to connect with that lucky chariot. However, my single running away Shartak from the smaller Dragon Ogre unit does manage to rally. Meanwhile, Chairman Banderas runs into the middle of the battlefield to give him good range with his 360-degree vision arc. If I can connect with that Chaos Warrior unit with him, I think I'll be able to assassinate those level 4 wizards. In the combat phase, my large Dragon Ogre unit managed to chop apart Scott's single-man unit and then turn round. The combat with Lambda, the dogs, and those 3 Chaos Knights, meanwhile, ends in an unlikely draw. On to Scott's turn. Rather than going for the easy single Dragon Ogre target, that arrogant Gorge's chariot goes for the 3-man unit to try to destroy them. With no wizard to oppose him, Scott's magic is more or less going off all the time, and he manages to get Steed of Shadows to fly that warrior unit well out of the range of Chairman Banderas. To do that though, he does have to march, and thus forego the opportunity to cast magic missiles this turn. In the Chaos Knight combat, Lambda and the dogs manage to kill a Chaos Knight, and the Knights manage to kill one of the dogs, leading to another unlikely draw. The Gorbeast chariot rolls out of the box once again and crushes 2 Dragon Ogres beneath its wheels. The one remaining Doger does manage to stick though, but it looks as though we're in danger of losing a 4th regiment to that infernal chariot. Right, Chaos turn 5 for me could be hot and spicy. Chairman Banderas spurns his demonic mount into the side of those Chaos Knights. he's joined by 2 other Chaos Hounds who those knights pathetically failed to put down last time. At the 3rd time of asking, the Forsaken managed to crash out of the wood into the side of that Gorbeast's chariot, and my single remaining Shartak from the regiment the Gorbeast's chariot destroyed in the first place also connects with its side. Surely now that thing is dead for all money, fighting 3 units. These combats are both of course easy wins for me, and my general makes short work of the remaining 2 Chaos Knights. Now, of course, in Warhammer the Old World, if you eliminate an enemy in combat, you have to take a test or you overrun forwards, regardless of whether you've charged or not. Lambda, Banderas, and both dog units promptly fail these overrun tests, and I cascade forwards towards the edge of the battlefield in a sea of randomness. In the chariot combat, I don't know how, the machine manages once again to chop apart one of my Dragon Ogre Shartaks, thus wiping out yet another Chaos Regiment, and I can't do anything to it in return. Last time I looked at chariot punks, I thought that they were the ones that were meant to do the charging and were garbage if they didn't. But this strange warped Chaos Chariot seems to specialise in being charged. In turn 5, Scott sweeps forward with the Steed of Shadows to get into range with his magic missiles to target the behinds of all of my troops that have failed their overrun tests. Fortunately, Lady Luck smiles on me and he doesn't do any damage. In the combat phase, finally, after all this effort, I manage to kill this infernal Gorbeast's chariot. However, the gods haven't finished screwing with me on that score, because again, both of my units fail their overrun tests, and both crash into each other. Had either of them passed, they would have been able to turn round and hit that Chaos Warrior unit there in the back. These overrun tests represent a huge injection of randomness into the game. The fact that you have to test all the time to see if you overrun, regardless of whether you've charged or not, and also have to go directly forwards if you fail it, means that you lose a lot of control over your pieces. And note, this test can't be re-rolled for any reason. That's another thing I'd rather like to change there about the rules. I'm all for a bit of randomness when it's interesting, but I'm not really sure why realistically you should overrun in turns where you haven't charged, never mind having to overrun directly forwards regardless of what flank you're in of the enemy. My turn 6 sees something very amusing. I managed to regain control over my regiments, and so Chairman Banderas, Lambda, and the 2 remaining dogs all decide to cower behind the hill, forming up into a unit to mutually protect each other from Scott's missiles. I think that looks rather cute, don't you? A nice couple walking the dogs on Sunday morning. Anyway, in Scott's turn 6, he goes for the Forsaken and manages to blow all 3 of them to hell. And with that comes the end of the game. Scott's lost his whole army except for that warrior block, whereas I'm hanging on to my level 2 wizard, my general, a few dogs, 1 dragon ogre, and also one of those picket lines of Forsaken. Counting up the points, we find that Scott's about 90 points ahead, but that's still well within the bracket for a draw. So, that brought the end of the game, and regardless of one's opinion on Warhammer the Old World as a competitive set of rules, that was undoubtedly a thrilling game of fantasy. It was tight, it was exciting, it featured a mixture of attacking and defensive play, and both me and Scott felt that we were in the game right until the end. In many ways, I think this game sums up my evolving opinions about Warhammer the Old World. The game's fun, there's absolutely no doubt about that. It's also Warhammer Fantasy, really Warhammer Fantasy as well. It's the real thing, the real McCoy, with plenty of tar. However, if you were into the competitive 8th edition 9th Age scene, where the rules really were streamlined enough for you to play smooth and competitive games against strangers, it's certainly true that some of the things that happen in these battles seem a little random. Random and highly dependent upon gentlemanly agreement in order to proceed. I think anybody who was a competitive player would have to be off their head to think that this is better than 8th edition, but at the end of the day, it's still Warhammer, it looks like Warhammer, and it feels like Warhammer. In the games of Age of Sigmar I played, they proceeded in grave, funeralaic, miserable silence. But here, I groaned, banged the table, and shouted at my models. Yes, the sounds of life, the sound of real Warhammer. So I think I'll close with some reflections on how my army performed from a competitive standpoint. Now, as I've already made clear, I think Warhammer the Old World has some big issues with it competitively. And so really, I think that players should just be advised to enjoy the game. Bring your models if they're the models you like, agree with your opponent the kind of game you want, roll dice and have fun. But if we are going to think about it competitively, because it's fun to do that kind of simulation, I would have the following thoughts about my army. First, let's start with the characters. Well, obviously my level 4 on foot was really outgunned in this game. My opponent had +6 to cast with his spells and the Infernal Puppet. When you've got a +2 advantage over another wizard, and remember you've got to beat a casting roll to dispel it, it's very difficult to actually really affect those dispels. Miss Mirror had rather a strop about this, and disappeared with my wretched demon and his Ferrari down to Soho. I've not seen her since. Really, that just confirms the absolutely essential status of a level 4 wizard if you're going to play this competitively. Although in this case, Miss Mirror's level 4 was no match for the level 6 that she was against the other side. As for my beta wizard Lambda on her horse, I just don't think I really used her properly and was unlucky with her. I do think there is some merit in having a level 2 wizard with lots of magic missiles out there on one flank outside of the enemy's likely main dispel aura, and I am expecting her to do rather better in future games. As for my 2 demonic steed mounted heroes, well, obviously Larry Luddite did very badly and there's not really so much we can say about that, but I do think my general, Chairman Banderas, did rather impressively. It's a pretty cheap build and the Ogre Blade is undoubtedly very strong. I think he's a pretty versatile Chaos Lord pick. Hard to justify him, I realise, over the Dragon if that's on the table, but I do think there is some competitive utility to this and using that 360-degree arc to really push the opponent back. As far as my core units were concerned, well look, you could see how useful the dogs were in this battle. They rallied, they flew around all over the place, they often weren't actually killed and were able to get back in the game. They were absolutely as annoying as hell. As for the Forsaken, well, they managed to kill a Chimera with that Steed of Shadows, throwing a little picket line amongst Scott's men. They were in a position where they could have got a massive back charge on Scott's main Chaos Warrior block, but the dice and the rules stuffed it up. I think they really were quite useful. Now, I have played other games of them where their impetuousness is a real problem, so you do have to be very careful with them. But I do think they are a worthy core unit in these little lines of 5. Going on to some of my other units, the Dragon Ogres didn't really have a great time of things, I think. They weren't in a position where they really could go head to head with another really strong enemy unit, and that's really where I think they excel. 30 games in, I've never claimed a rank bonus in Warhammer the Old World, and quite frankly, I never intend to. Right, I think that's a wrap, folks. I hope you enjoyed my opening battle report in Warhammer the Old World. Critical, yes. But to be critical is to think, and to think is to understand. Alright, punks. Good night.